Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio, a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers what used to be known as the global war on terror and what we describe as the Long War. For today's episode of Generation Jihad, we have probably our most frequent guest, I believe, Edmund Fitton-Brown. He's a friend of Generation Jihad, and until very recently, the coordinator for the United Nations Security Council's Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. And also joining us is Caleb Weiss. He's a senior analyst at the Bridgeway Foundation and longtime contributor to FDD's Long War Journal, also my colleague and friend. Gentlemen, welcome to Generation Jihad. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. We're gonna talk about the Islamic State. There's a lot going on. Edmund teamed his most recent report, that excellent report from mid-July. It's chock full of details on the Islamic State's organization, its regional networks, and the state of play. We're gonna jump into the Islamic State here. I just want to delve into one issue that Edmund and I discussed on that last podcast. And that was the issue of, who is the bigger threat here? I'm going to read directly from Edmund's report. This is the only time I'm going to do it on today's podcast. And it says this: member states continue to judge that ISIL, which of course is Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, poses the more immediate threat in this regard, although some regard al-Qaeda as the more dangerous group in the longer term. Edmund, I think you know, and everyone knows my view on that. I agree with the latter. Al-Qaeda, given its strategic thinking, its ability to work with others, the fact that it has state sponsorship in some cases, that makes it a more dangerous enemy. It's more patient. Edmund, tell us what you think about that particular statement.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And it's great to be here. And I think I really like the fact that we're doing this as a sort of complement what we said a month ago. And I think it's really important that we do. This point about the short-term versus the long-term threat, it's complicated, but it really matters, not least because the wrong kind of terrorist attack taking place is the biggest issue for many member states. And most of the member states that the monitoring team talks to are in a pretty firm agreement that the most likely source of the next big attack is ISIL, not al-Qaeda. And I think that's really important. It means that whatever we say about al-Qaeda as a long-term threat, and I think that is right, I think it is. I think its resilience is very threatening. I think the Afghanistan development is very dangerous. And I think its long-term capability is very worrying. And I think it's much more tactically, in fact, actually tactically and strategically astute than ISIL. Nevertheless, ISIL still has a lot of oomph left over from it's the way that it flared into life in the previous decade, and still a lot of support. And of course, its propaganda is much more effective, or at least it's much more palatable, eye-catching than al-Qaeda's propaganda. And there's another distinction I want to make here, which is between where attacks take place. So there may be very damaging al-Qaeda attacks that take place within conflict zones, but where any of these groups is going to get the most traction and probably is going to perceive the most value is in a major international attack, an attack that they can launch in a non-conflict zone. And that's much more likely to come from ISIL than from al-Qaeda. And then the last nuance that I wanted to throw in is just to remember that, in a lot of places, it's not that clear where the distinction lies between what the inspiration is behind an attack. And a lot of European member states have reported that they're seeing a kind of generalized inspiration where an attack might take place and it might not be absolutely clear as to whether it's inspired by ISIL or by al-Qaeda. And again, that brings us back to the point, which is, at what point do we have hybrids or new brands emerging? So I think these are all complexities we have to acknowledge. But I think if we're saying if there were to be a large scale attack with strategic impact in North America or in Europe or in, East Asia, who would be the most likely source of it, either as the directing force or the inspiring force? And I think the answer to that is ISIS.
And I'm going to just add one more thing to that. I agree with everything you said on the attack side. I think there's another component of this, which is the threat, which contributes to the attack side, and that's the caliphate building project. And I think when I look at this, the ability to have safe haven and state sponsorship is far more important to the success of these groups than any individual attack that may be launched inside a country. So this is why I also view Al Qaeda. Now the Iranian state sponsorship is, to me, very clear. But more importantly, now they have Afghanistan. They have both safe haven and state sponsorship there. And as they build that caliphate, as they build those safe havens, then they develop the capacity. And I think that is something that is often missed in the analysis of so the Islamic State may be able to pull off a big attack today, may have more capacity to do so. But I believe this is where I look at it in the longer term. That's why it makes Al Qaeda more dangerous. They're not just able to launch an attack or plan or execute attack, but they're having far more success in their caliphate building project because of their patience. The Islamic State declares a caliphate in Syria in 2014. And it's gone by 2000 I'd say 18, 19, right? Al Qaeda has worked for years to build an emirate help the Taliban build their emirate in Afghanistan. 20 years, a long project. And I don't see that going anywhere. And that's what makes Al Qaeda far more dangerous to me. Any response to that, Edmund?
First of all, I agree with you about the impatience of ISIS. And by the way, I'm going to say ISIS because, otherwise we're going to end up in a sort of terminology tongue twister. So I'm going to use ISIS. That impatience definitely, it brought them some benefits, but it also brought them, destruction. And I wanted to sort of chip in with Marawi, of course. Let's not forget what happened in the southern Philippines. Yeah. Again, the same kind of impatience. They sort of established their sort of like the sort of little tiny so-called caliphate there as well. But, they couldn't help themselves. They just created a standing target. They decided to go down fighting and of course, effectively decapitated their operations in Southeast Asia. So I think you're right. I think there's something that's a bit self-defeating about the way they do these things. But I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail, but just to flag the point of ISIS is generating these networks overseas with a purpose. Now, how successfully they'll do it is not clear. And I completely agree with you that the project of Al Qaeda is much more advanced and much more patient. And if you look at the strength of a group like Al-Shabaab, you can see that they're on a level that no ISIS affiliate is even close to. And so that is definitely true. But there is a downside to the Al-Qaeda approach from the point of view of threat generation. And that is that there is a genuine conflict operating in those remote provinces, if we can use the ISIS terminology for Al-Qaeda. And that is, what are we doing here? Is our agenda local, or is it regional, or is it global? And that is a weakness in Al-Qaeda. And although the Al-Qaeda global leadership is clear that the agenda should be global, they're having to put up with giving an enormous amount of autonomy to the provinces to make their own decisions on that. And that may slow any kind of global threat regeneration.
Yeah, I look at that as, and Caleb, I'm going to ask you to weigh in here as well. I look at that as the global and the local go hand in hand for Al Qaeda, and it's building that caliphate project is, goes from local to regional to global, and it goes up and down that chain, right? So I think Al Qaeda's leadership understands that. I actually think that's all part of the plan. To me, the weakness is it doesn't generate those, when they're looking at it this way, it doesn't often, or they've gotten away from generating those high profile attacks that were good for drawing in more recruits. But Caleb, anything to add to that discussion? I don't want this conversation to dominate I think we got a lot to delve into with the Islamic State. But if you have anything to add, Caleb, I'd love to hear it.
No, I think you summed up what I was going to say, of that both the local and the global sort of goes hand in hand, the way I see it, especially in terms of what, AQ says, both in terms of AQ General Command as well as, the branches of, they don't really differentiate between the local and the global or regional. It's all sort of the same generalized fight for and in defense of Muslims. So I think you summed that up nice, but I do want to get back a little bit to the Caliphate building project. Thinking of these groups as like learning organizations, at what point do we start talking about the Islamic State learning from mistakes? We know that AQ learned from mistakes. We know that, they preempted or they acted too soon in Mali, of enacting their sort of, Islamic Emirate in Mali, which brought about, the French intervention. We know that there's sort of the same thing in Yemen, both in 2011 and 2015. And AQ learns from those mistakes of, sort of advertising those statehoods too soon or before they're ready to be defended. At what point do we start talking about, the Islamic State learning from that? Is there really this ideological need to continuously have, an immediate statehood, or do they start, learning from that and slowing it down, if that makes sense? Or is that ideologically, they can't do that? I think that's an open debate, but something for me to keep in mind of, we know that AQ learned from those mistakes. Why can't the Islamic State?
Yeah, and I think Edmund brought up a very excellent point, which we're going to delve into more, is how it's rebuilding these networks. I think we're seeing a more sophisticated Islamic State doing things in the background instead of, full-throated, let's, establish the caliphate. I mean, I think we're seeing some of that. Part of, a big weakness for the Islamic State, to me, always is its inability to play well with others and its inability to accept state sponsorship. It's one of the biggest criticism the Islamic State has of Al-Qaeda. And I think until we see it do to be more accommodating on these two issues, it's going to limit its ability. But it's possible the Islamic State learns over time. And that's, and if that's the case, then you're going to have two very sophisticated terrorist organizations out there in competition.
Just a little bit of caution about how strategically coherent they are. They didn't make it work well in Syria. They really didn't. And you got the clash between Haras ad-Din and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and that is still not resolved. And they had external attack aspirations as Al-Qaeda in Syria, and they couldn't carry them out. They couldn't resource them, and they couldn't staff them. They couldn't actually make them happen. So I think we need to be slightly careful about thinking that Al-Qaeda will always get this right. There's no declared contradiction in the regional agenda and the global agenda. But in the case of Al-Shabaab, you can clearly see that they put all of their effort into the either Somali or near neighborhood. And there's a sort of a understanding, I think, between them and Al-Qaeda that this is okay and it works, but it's a slow process. And so this is why, in the end, I think we all agree that the longer term threat is greater from Al-Qaeda. But if you're the security services in Europe or in North America or in other non-conflict zones, you can't think about primarily what's going to happen in 5 years' time. What's going to worry you is what might happen in 6 months' time or tomorrow. And so that's why I think this is an interesting creative tension, and I understand why it's difficult for Western authorities to sort of ignore that the more immediate threat is from ISIS. On that point about learning the lessons, I think that's a really key point. It's really good to go back and remember what happened in various places where Al-Qaeda has been through that process. And Yemen is a good example of that I remember very well. So that temptation to dominate space, it's understandable. In a way, it's necessary. But you've got to also be careful that you don't then draw down massive counterterrorism resources against you. And in that respect, I think another point that's worth making here is that ISIS, I think, is more focused on the absolute determination to revive the global threat. The propaganda is all about that. It's all about this is what we've got to do. Where I think they have a weakness is that, unlike Al Qaeda, there is a sense of, sort of an assumption that everybody else should simply do the bidding of the leadership. And we don't know how that plays out over time. For now, there's a reasonable level of expression of cohesiveness in ISIS, but may not always occur. It may be that some of the regional presences will feel a little taken for granted. We do all the sacrifice and we have no voice in how things are supposed to work. And then the very last point that I want to make on this is the leadership. We've got a new leader of ISIS. We don't yet know what direction he's going to take them. And so that, I think, is a really important point for monitoring.
Go ahead, Caleb. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to segue into who do you think the actual, Abu al-Hassan is? I know that your recent report mentions 3 possible candidates, but is there one that sort of jumps out as the most, likely candidate for you?
It's really hard to say, Caleb. I mean, I think what I would say is that I'm privately skeptical about Sumaidai as a candidate, even though he's the one who's had the most airplay. I feel that there are good reasons why it probably isn't him. Reading between the lines, and this is where one can go a little bit beyond what's in the report, because the report will always just, as it has to, quite rightly, stick to what we're hearing from member states. But that also means that we sometimes leave out what's appearing from member states indirectly, but we can't verify it because we've not ourselves heard it from a member state. But there's a sense that probably the Turks did get Sumaidai. And I don't believe that the leader of ISIS would have been in Turkey. So, if that were true, then that would rule him out. And so, then there was the question of Baghdadi's brother. I just don't know on that one, but there's not much member state enthusiasm behind that analysis either. So I have to say I feel the jury is still out.
Awesome, yeah. I don't know as well as you do on that question. It's just there's, like you said, a lot of airplay with Sumait, the one that Turkey supposedly got. Which it's cool to hear you talk about that, because that was sort of an open question as well of who the hell did Turkey actually arrest? And that was, sort of a debate a few months ago when that happened. But yeah, this is an open-ended question. I don't know if we'll ever figure out. It took forever to figure out who, Abu Ibrahim actually was.
Oh, I think we know who Abu Ibrahim was. I think that's clear enough.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when he was announced, we didn't know who he was at first, but it was a long investigation. Eventually found out. I suspect the same thing will happen here.
Yes, I agree. I think that's where it's going.
It really is interesting how opaque the process is for the leadership of the Islamic State versus Al Qaeda, where we know these are established individuals. I mean, we may not know who's going to succeed Zawahiri, but we have a good idea. The individuals who may succeed him, that we have the background on them. We have the bios on them. We know who the very likely candidates, whereas the Islamic State keeps us guessing. I always find that to be an interesting dynamic.
Right.
And also to be a weakness, because it has to cause guessing within the leadership of the Islamic State within what they call their provinces, right? Right.
Well, that's what Edmund was saying about, the long-term sort of, danger for IS of do these anonymized leaders pose a long-term problem for them of, the rank and file in, DRC, for instance, pledging allegiance to, Abu al-Hassan, who they don't really know who that is. Does that pose a long-term threat for them of having these anonymous Kunya leaders?
Yeah, here's a couple of questions. In the case of Abu Ibrahim, was he partly the victim of just frustration at the extreme precautions that he was having to take just to remain invisible? And we pointed out that risk while he was still alive. That there was a danger that people are saying, "Well, who is this guy? He never speaks. We only ever hear from the spokesperson." And so I wonder whether that ultimately affects someone like him. And then with a new guy, of course, one of the most interesting things about the press coverage of the arrest of Sumaydai, if it was Sumaydai in Turkey, is what does ISIS do with that? Because, they've set up the succession. They've made the announcement through a new spokesperson. They've done all the choreography of all the pledges of allegiance. And then somebody says, and there's a lot of airplay around it, oh, he's been arrested in Turkey. Now, I think probably he wasn't. Or probably, at any rate, the leader of ISIS, I think, is probably still at liberty. But what does ISIS do by way of response? Because as you say, Caleb, a lot of their guys around the world, they read that report and they have no way of suspecting it of being untrue, other than that they suspect that their enemies would always lie.
I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Today we have Edmund Fitton-Brown. He's until recently, the coordinator for the United Nations Security Council's Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. Also, we have Caleb Weiss. He's a senior analyst at the Bridgeway Foundation and a longtime contributor to FDD's Long War Journal. Gentlemen, the Islamic State in Africa. Let's get started. I think the right place to start here is Mozambique. What do you think, Caleb?
Yeah, which is let's follow the order of the report. I think that makes the most sense for the listeners.
Edmund, what's going on in Mozambique? What's the Islamic State network look like there?
Well, absolutely. And just very quickly by way of introduction, each of our last three reports has had one sort of big thing that sort of jumped out as the sort of the headline. And it was the one 3 ago. In other words, the one that was published in July 2021 that really majored on Mozambique, because of course there was that dramatic development around the town of Palma in early 2021, and then of course the next report was dominated by Afghanistan, and then the most recent report was dominated by events in Syria and the changes in the leadership of ISIS. But of course, none of the concerns about Africa have gone away or been resolved. What did happen, of course, in Mozambique was that the local government did accept some assistance from friendly countries. And that assistance did seem to make a difference in the sense that the momentum that the local group, Ansar al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, ASWJ, or I think colloquially they call them Al-Shabaab locally, but we tend not to say that because it creates a confusion because it's not directly related to Al-Shabaab in Somalia. But ASWJ or ISIL Mozambique, as ISIL would have it, or ISIL Central Africa Province, as they are also sometimes described. They have struggled a little bit more over the past year. They've suffered a lot of CT pushback, and they've also suffered from some environmental difficulties, some issues of drought and famine, difficulty of subsistence for fighters and dependents and that sort of thing. Even so, it would be quite wrong to suggest that the situation in Mozambique has been resolved. I think, at one point we were talking about a potential threat to the provincial capital of Pemba. We see that as having receded in the sense that we don't think it's an imminent threat. But I think the risk that those fighters who are still at large, still able to attack small villages pretty much at will, area of operations somewhat spreading, including somewhat outside Cabo Delgado province, suggests that this story is going to have a number of future episodes.
The report notes that there's links between ASWJ and the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, what's also known as the ADF in the Congo. There's a lot of information in open source on this. There's a discussion of movements of fighters between the groups. Talk more about that. And Caleb, also, I'd like to hear you weigh in on this as well.
I'll just say a few words, Bill, and then move it to Caleb, because I think Caleb's more over the detail of this than I am. But I think from the point of view of the monitoring team, again, we have to rely on what we've directly received from member states. And so there's clearly an enormous complexity about the way that the various offshoots of ISIS interact in Africa. But the key here is to mention the Al-Qarar office in Somalia. So ISIS has organized these hubs and spokes, and the report is full of, it's probably the most detailed account published of the ISIS hubs and spokes, the regional networks that they've created. And the hub of their, what we might almost refer to as, some people call it ISCAP, Central Africa Province, but we tend to think of it as their Eastern, Central, and Southern African network. The hub of that is in Somalia. It's in Puntland in Somalia. And the Al-Qarar office is the hub established by the ISIS General Directorate of Provinces. So that's the leadership in Iraq and Syria that has appointed somebody to act as a coordinator based in Somalia. But rather than that person being responsible just for Somalia, that person is responsible for ISIS interests in the wider region. So that's the key node point. And up to now, the evidence we've seen tends to link Somalia to Mozambique and Somalia to DRC. We haven't seen much evidence of direct links between DRC and Somalia. But we have seen also evidence of links between Somalia and South Africa, Somalia and various other locations in East, Central, and Southern Africa. And the other thing we report in our latest report is that the Al-Qarar office appears to have some kind of financial remit that even goes beyond that regional network and has some relevance for ISIS interests elsewhere in Africa. So, for example, in West Africa, and to some degree even outside Africa, specifically with reference to Afghanistan. So this is an emerging picture, and we only have I would say we have a very partial sketch of this picture. And I'm sure there is a lot in terms of direct crossover between Mozambique and DRC. But at the moment, we're seeing it more in terms of these tentacles emanating from Somalia.
I'm going to jump in real quick and then, Caleb, turn it over to you. It's very Al-Qaeda-like, right? We see this with the Al-Qaeda branches, sharing of information, sharing of fighters, sharing of, cash going back and forth, coordination, things of that nature. So I find that this is what, to me, on the Islamic State side of this report, I found to be the most fascinating, the establishment of these offices, which I kind of view to be somewhat analogous to Al-Qaeda's branches, or what people call their affiliates, and what Al-Qaeda actually itself at least used to describe as its theaters. So go ahead, Caleb.
Well, I just want to jump back into what he said about Al-Qarar sending money sort of to ISKP in Afghanistan, because, I'm a nerd and this is fascinating to me. But this is a general question for you, Edmund, of does this signify, sort of the growing importance of Al-Qarar or IS Somalia in general? Or why do you think that, the central leadership has tasked that regional hub with that? Or is that sort of a reflection of the money coming out of that node, or why do you think that is?
It's a really interesting question, and we try to get into that in the report. But as always, we leave the picture where we have evidence, and we don't sort of go very far down the track of it might be this or it might be that. Certainly, what seems to be happening with these ISIS regional networks is that they're reinforcing success. So where it's working, they are then sort of saying, well, that's great, let's do more of that. And where it's not really working, as in Libya, for example, which we mentioned as having been a sort of rather withered hub, then they're saying, okay, well, that's not seeming to pan out in the way that we would have hoped. So I would speculate that what's happened is that Al-Qarar office has been so well established, and possibly because the extent of the Somali diaspora in Africa has been able to show its effectiveness, not just in this outreach into Mozambique, DRC, South Africa, other parts of the region, but also across into Western Africa. And so I think there may be an element, therefore, of this sort of, just reinforcing success. This is what they're good at. In terms of raising the money, we think there is some local raising of money, but it's not clear to us how much of the money that they move is raised locally and how much of it is actually them acting as a relay point for funds coming from elsewhere. And then why? Why would they be particularly good at this? I mean, it may be, again, something Hawala type work operating through Somali diaspora. But also the question is, what would be the relay point between Somalia and Afghanistan? Because that's not immediately obvious. We do think one of the few remaining relevances of ISIS in Yemen is that it has a strong link across the Red Sea from Yemen to ISIS in Somalia. So maybe a relay through Yemen could be relevant there. But also, of course, it could equally be, you've got very significant Somali diaspora elsewhere in the world. And there was even one, which we did mention this, but it was a very, very sort of one of those things where we just say, we're going to mention this because it's interesting, but we have no way of evaluating how likely it is. But there was one suggestion that there might have been a relay through the United Kingdom. So you can kind of see how that could work. But I still remain, my feeling is that we need to monitor this. And I say we, but I mean, this is my beloved colleagues whom I've left behind. This is their challenge, and we'll see what they come up with in December when the next report is being written. But this is one of their challenges, is to bottom this out, to say, okay, so we believe that Al Qarar office has this financial role, possibly quasi-globally. How does it work?
I know we're getting a little off our planned outline here, but this is fascinating to me, and I like what you said about the the importance of the Hawala network, especially within the Somali diaspora. I mean, Somalia is a country that didn't have a central bank until 2012, and it's still a country that relies heavily on foreign remittances from the diaspora through Hawala or through other money transfer services. So to me, my working assumption has always been because of that. They've already have these established diaspora networks around the world based around the Somali diaspora using Hawala. And then, it does work, and to an extent, kind of untraceable or harder to track than most other sort of, money transfers. And Somalia sort of has the history of remittances of, Hawala being used for, terrorism financing or potential terrorism financing. There was that case in 2002 or 2003 of Al Baraka, of the Somali Hawala system that was shut down for supposedly funding AQ. I mean, so there's a history of sort of these Hawala networks within the Somali diaspora. So I like that you mentioned that. That's always been my working assumption of that makes the most sense to me, than with just how globally spread out that diaspora is.
And I think this is a great example of the Islamic State leveraging strengths of the organization. The Islamic State in Somalia isn't strong as, Shabab is the dominant force there. Islamic State is, however you want to rank it on the scale, but it's insignificant basically compared to what Al-Shabaab is doing. And
operationally, yes. Yeah.
Yet plays a key node within the Islamic State's network. And I think that's probably a part of learning. The Islamic State tried to reestablish itself as an option against Shabab. It really hasn't done it, but yet it's leveraged this Al-Qarar office. And, so it's, leveraging the success of a part of a network. Maybe it didn't go as planned, but it certainly took advantage of it.
I think there's another point that I just highlight again. We talk about this a little in the report, which is, the importance of what may be quite significant donations from private individuals. We mention Ugandan individuals, also South African, and also some donations that have been raised from individuals actually resident in South Africa. And again, I'm making a connection here that I can't substantiate, and it's not in the report because it can't be substantiated. But there is clearly some potentially significant source of funding from private donations within Africa. And if that Somali diaspora network and Hawala network is processing that, involved in that, you can see how that could make sense. You could have strategically significant sums of money that have to be moved to the right location where they're needed. And maybe that helps to explain the significance of Al-Qarar office.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very reasonable assumption, and it should be. I'm certain it is with being investigated. It's amazing. The Hawala networks have been a problem from the beginning, and here we are in 2022, still discussing them to this day. I find that fascinating and frustrating and disappointing all at the same time. So let's quickly talk about the ADF in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I think this is a growing strength of the Islamic State in Africa. What are your thoughts on that, Edmund?
Yes, it's interesting because it's right on the edge, isn't it, between Central Africa and East Africa. And in fact, in our report, we slightly distinguish between what's happening in DRC and Uganda and Rwanda on that basis. Whereas, of course, they're right next to each other. And I mean, of course, one of the most interesting things about this, and I want to defer to Caleb on this because he knows far more in detail than I do. But again, this is a case of a pre-existing conflict and pre-existing groups that have now sort of self-identified as ISIS affiliate, and ISIS have accepted that, and something is clearly growing in significance. And whereas, as I said, in early 2021, within this broad area, we saw the developments in Mozambique as being by far the most eye-catching. The experience of the last year or so has actually been slightly more alarming in DRC and Uganda and Rwanda, and generally in regards to the ADF, than it has been in relation to ASWJ in Mozambique. And one of the key things I think here is, first of all, you've got a very easy transnational sort of issue here. The fact is that these many of these guys in Eastern DRC, they're actually Ugandan. So almost by definition, this is an international issue. We've seen more evidence of foreign terrorist fighters present in that theatre than we have in Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. Now, again, in northern Mozambique, there's the clear crossover with Tanzania, and a lot of the ASWJ people are Tanzanians. But those are sort of border people. But people coming from further afield, we see more evidence of that with ADF. And we highlighted, I think it was in our previous report published in January, a particularly concerning Jordanian who had been picked up in Eastern DRC. And then in the latest report, we've talked about the arrest of Kenyans, Tanzanians, Somalis in the Eastern DRC. So I think we've come to the view that the development of ISIS Central Africa Province, if we want to call it that, is probably now a little bit more advanced in the Eastern DRC than it is in northern Mozambique. And I also come back to there was a jailbreak a couple of years ago, and that remains of concern to me because that was a huge jailbreak, freeing I think it was almost 2,000 inmates. So of course, you still have a chaotic picture. You've got a lot of militias, a lot of organized criminals, more or less organized criminals. And ISIS isn't the only game in town, but I think it is growing in significance in that part of the ADF that is fully committed to ISIS.
Yeah, I mean, Edmund, you nailed that. I think we're sort of seeing the same thing, at least. What me and my colleagues at Bridgeway Foundation have written about openly of sort of, 2021 did see an influx of, foreign fighters, particularly Kenyans, Tanzanians. And you mentioned that in a report of at least one of them, prominent one who was featured in a beheading video, arrested. Sort of the big concern with those guys are, some of them do have prior experience with other militant groups, which can bring, sort of expertise or, shorten the knowledge gap for the ADF in terms of capabilities. That's something that, should be worrying to the region. Another thing I like to think about, is what is the potential for sort of the ADF being like this regional hub for the Islamic State across East Africa, of being sort of like a training and experience hub of these foreigners who, want battlefield experience, who want training. They make their way to Congo. They fight a bit for the ADF. They get trained and then go back to their countries of origin. And have the potential for new attacks, there, which is something that we talked about in a report for CTC earlier this year. That's Combating Terrorism Center. I think that's the worrying thing to me about the Islamic State, sort of what we suspect is their plans for the ADF, of not only being sort of a financial hub, but sort of this regional, attack hub. Because you mentioned the plot in Rwanda that happened, last September and October. There was sort of, all sorts of plots and bombings in Uganda last year. There was, bombings, in DRC, particularly one in Goma, that, I don't know if can technically talk about, because it was a leaked UN report from the GOE that talked about a bombing in Goma that was probably committed by ADF, which, if that's true, that's a worrying development, because Goma is the largest city in Eastern Congo. If that was the ADF, that represents a large shift away from their AO in Congo for them to be able to pull that off. But then, you talk about the jailbreak in 2020, but they just did a jailbreak last month or 2 months ago. I think it was last month, actually, in August, in Butembo, which is another city in Eastern Congo, that's sort of south of their normal AO, where they freed like 800 inmates. A few hundred of them have been recaptured, but there's still a sizable chunk of, inmates who are going to join the group from that. So it's a group that is, I think, rising in strength, like Edmund said. And I think that's absolutely true. And it's part of, I think, the Islamic State's wider plan for East Africa. They're sort of, celebrating successes. It's telling them, it's certainly, wanting them to be more successful for that, the whole regional attack hub, if that makes sense, is at least the way I think it's playing out. Could certainly be wrong. But it makes the most sense to me, certainly, of what we saw last year with all the attacks and attack plots, sort of around East Africa.
Just to say, great points, Kale. I agree with all of that. Again, I think the idea that you could have, as it were, an organizational and financial hub in Somalia, but the recognition that the best fighting location would be Eastern DRC makes a lot of sense to me. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think a critical factor in all of this is we must monitor the evolution of the FTF picture. And that's why, I think both of us have highlighted the growing evidence of FTFs in DRC, mainly Africans, but there was the Jordanian guy and the question of what capability he was bringing in. And I think if we see this continue to grow, then I think your hypothesis that this is becoming a training ground, I think, would grow in weight.
Yeah, and just to put it in local context, because you mentioned, ADF's not the only player in town, which they're not. There's 120 armed groups across Eastern Congo. But I think one point people need to realize is that ADF is by far the most deadly of all of Eastern Congo's sort of militias. And that in and of itself is a worrying development.
Yeah. And so the last point about FTS, which I perhaps should have made earlier, is it's not just that these, what capability these guys bring and what capability they develop while they're in theatre. It's the fact that this is, they embody the connection between the regional agenda and the global agenda. If you've got FTFs there, they're also thinking about what could we do in Kenya? What could we do, further afield? And that's where I think this, again, it comes back to the point that you made so ably earlier on, Bill, and that is that, you create your safe haven, and then you build your capability, and then you project your threat back to the non-conflict zones.
Yeah, absolutely. We could discuss all of these topics in depth. I'm going to try and get finish the sweep of Africa and then move on. You had mentioned jailbreak, so I think that was a good segue to move over to Islamic State West Africa province, and there was a major jailbreak just outside the capital of Nigeria. Before we just move into Islamic State West Africa province, I think this is probably a good test case where the Islamic State made some mistakes of not dealing with the local, right? With Boko Haram, when the West Africa province was formed, you had some issues. Abu Bakr Shekau, who was a very interesting character in the jihad, so to speak. He and his faction within there were not happy with being subsumed to West Africa province. So you had a little bit of problems there, but I still think the Islamic State has had a lot of success, particularly in West Africa and Nigeria specifically. So tell us a little bit about what's going on for Islamic State West Africa province.
Yeah. So, I mean, at no stage has West Africa been the dominant theme of one of our reports. But what I can say is that in most of the reports that we've written over the last few years, it's been a kind of a unbroken story of success for ISIS and very few setbacks. And even the setbacks that they have had, they seem to, you mentioned earlier, do they learn from things? They do seem to have learned in West Africa province. They show signs of being able to learn. One of the reasons that they couldn't live with Shekau was because he was just such a maverick, no discipline at all. And one thing at least you can say of West Africa province is that they're pretty disciplined, and they operate in a way they're very brutal. Of course, they are very brutal, but I would say that their MO there has not been as sort of self-defeating as the kind of the gleeful sadism has been in some other places. They're a little bit more judicious in the way that they project their, the way they intimidate, the way that they force people to collaborate with them. And the worrying thing from the monitoring team's point of view was just to sort of see, semester after semester in which they had significant successes. They were successfully attacking the Nigerian military, successfully mounting operations in Niger and Chad and Cameroon, and very few setbacks. And, they were getting war spoils from this. They were getting military equipment, and they were getting arms and ammunition. And so then you had the showdown with Shekau in the Sambisa forest, which took place. And that, again, came out in West Africa province's favor. They killed Shekau. And what we said in our latest report is that some of the sort of subsuming of Shekau's people into West Africa province, that hasn't been straightforward. It's been tricky. They have grown in strength. They have absorbed some of Shekau's fighters, but some are still operating as sort of, Shekau legacy elements, and some have surrendered to the Niger. Well, in fact, a very large number of the Shekau community surrendered to the Nigerian authorities. But still, we now put West Africa province as numerically the strongest ISIS province in the world outside the core region. So numerically stronger than Khorasan. And that's really quite something. So the question then arises, how strategically significant is this? The other point, again, coming back to our regional networks model, is that of the three most successful ISIS regional networks and coordinating offices, two of them are in Africa. We already mentioned the Al-Qarar office in Somalia. The other one is Al-Furqan office, which is in the Lake Chad Basin, essentially in northeastern Nigeria and on those borders that I mentioned. And the third, globally speaking, is the Al-Sadiq office in Afghanistan. So this is another successful office, another office that they've reinforced. It has some kind of authority over or support role for the so-called Greater Sahara province, the people who are operating in the sort of further west in the Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso sort of border area. And we also noted there that quite a strong ISIS core involvement in the affairs of West Africa Province and the Al Furqan office. And this was embodied by Barnawi, Abu Musab al-Barnawi, who went back and forth between being the emir of West Africa Province and being the head of the Al Furqan office. Now, we don't know his current status. The Nigerians say he's been killed, but we, at least my last time, when I left the monitoring team, we still haven't seen persuasive reporting so that we couldn't say that. We just said, well, there are reports that he's been killed, but we had seen other reports that he might have reverted to his role as head of the Al Furqan office. So I don't know what the situation is with Barnawi, but it is striking that one of the few things where West African Province has had a little bit of chaos, it has been in the leadership, sort of people coming and going, rivalry, people in significant roles being deposed, people being killed, sort of, as it were, executed internally by West Africa Province. But that never seems to disrupt them. It seems that the strategic direction that they're taking and their very successful tactics have continued.
Very briefly, we're going to move real quickly through this discussion. What's the what do you view the strategic threat versus between the Islamic State, Greater Sahara versus Al Qaeda? Who in West Africa? Who seems to have or actually both theaters, right? The Greater Sahara and West Africa. Who seems to have the upper hand in this? This is obviously, I don't think this is something discussed in the report. More of your personal assessment of that, Edmund.
So further east, particularly in the Lake Chad Basin, definitely ISIS has the upper hand. Further west, in Mali, Burkina Faso, no doubt Al-Qaeda has the upper hand. So Greater Sahara province of ISIS, it can't be ignored, but it's relatively small and it's overmatched by Jainim. And whenever they've come to blows, Jainim, Jainim, the local Al-Qaeda coalition, has tended to get the upper hand. And there's a sense that Jainim has a very, very high degree of strategic awareness of what it's trying to achieve. And this is, again, comes back to your earlier point, why we should be more worried about Al-Qaeda. Because if anyone is actually going to overturn these rather fragile states like Mali, like Burkina Faso, even some intrusion into the littoral states. We've seen activity in Senegal, we've seen activity in Côte d'Ivoire, we've seen activity in Togo and Benin. So that sort of long-term incubating threat where you could have a failed state or you could have a very substantial tract of territory that is a safe haven for a terrorist group to generate an external operational capability. Certainly, the further west you go, that threat is almost exclusively from Al-Qaeda. But I am still very concerned about ISIS West Africa Province. And again, this is where I worry about what we don't know. We don't know what the situation is with foreign terrorist fighters in the Lake Chad Basin. We've seen reports of some. They've talked about light-skinned Arabs. There's some suggestion you might have some Libyans there or maybe some other North Africans there. But we just don't know. We were never given really authoritative briefing on that. But it's one to watch because, as I said, it's the largest ISIS province outside the core region by number. It's the one that has had the most sort of unbroken period of local successes. And so if you were to add to that a strong connectivity to the outside, and that could, of course, we know of some connectivity between that theatre and Libya. But if we could extend that then to say that you've got foreign fighters, then you would be looking for that to turn into an external threat capability before too long.
Caleb, any thoughts? I'm in agreement with you, Edmund.
Yeah, I think Edmund knocked this one out of the park, as usual. But it sort of going back to ISGS and the Sahel and the Littoral West Africa, I think the greatest threat that ISGS poses, at least in the short term, is the scale of massacres that they can commit. This is a group that is capable of killing hundreds of civilians, which they do, sort of on a routine basis, every few months. But that's not necessarily a strategic threat. I think Edmund was right. The JNIM, the local Al-Qaeda branch, coalition, whatever you want to call it, is definitely the longer strategic threat. I mean, this is this is an area that, in 2007, Yunus al-Mauritani, who was, sort of the dual-hatted, AQIM, AQ senior leader, wrote a report, talking about the chances for jihad across West Africa. And to, a certain degree, AQ, especially JNIM, is sort of following in that playbook of, these are the communities we could reach. These are the areas that, have the greatest chance of success for jihad. And, some of the areas they talked about were Senegal, were, northern Benin, were Burkina, were, southern central Mali. I mean, so this is sort of, a thing that they've been planning for a long time and are able to, now finally actualize. And, Edmund talked about the spread into the littorals, but that can only happen with, sort of a complete meltdown of Burkina Faso. A lot of this is emanating from Burkina Faso and, outside of, the central regions where Ouagadougou is, really it's JNIM with some ISGS remnants, but it's largely JNIM attacking all sort of around Burkina and then sort of seeping into the littorals from there. And to me, I think that's a giant strategic threat that, is something that the region itself is struggling to contain. And certainly the French and other Europeans this is the next thing to try to combat of how do we stop that flow into West Africa, the littoral West Africa. And that's not something that, I certainly don't have the answers to right now, but this is something that, 5 years from now, this is something that people should be worried about of, just how far the violence emanating from Mali and Burkina Faso will spread. And not to paint, a certain dire picture right now, but it's hard to be optimistic about the future for West Africa.
Well said, Caleb. I'm Bill Raggio. This is Generation Jihad. Joining us today to talk about the local, the regional, and the global threat posed by the Islamic State is Edmund Fitton-Brown and Caleb Weiss. We're going to touch on one more area very quickly on in North Africa, particularly in Libya. I think this is just an interesting case for both, not just the Islamic State, for Al-Qaeda, where their footprint has greatly decreased. It seems that both groups have had the same problems. They're currently basically hiding in the southern desert. But, I think the fact that they're there, Edmund, I think your report said that there was about 100 Islamic State fighters thought to be there. That obviously that's what the member states are telling you. It may be more, it may be less. We don't really know. I'm always skeptical of estimates like that because of my experience with Afghanistan. But you know what? These are groups that you just can't take your eyes off these groups. I mean, I think that Ansaru in Nigeria is, which is basically an Al-Qaeda allied or Al-Qaeda linked group in Nigeria. They went moribund for multiple years and then they reemerged after regrouping and restructuring and have stepped up attacks. Caleb has done some excellent work on that. Edmund, talk to us just briefly about Libya and the problems the Islamic State has experienced there.
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. I mean, I think the problem was, again, a little bit, as we referred to earlier, sort of their strategic impatience, their that tendency to overreach and burn out. So, they made some progress. At one point, I think when I first joined the monitoring team in 2017, it was the remote province in Libya that was regarded as the one most likely to emerge as the host of a new external attack capability, and they just didn't handle it well. And I think Libya is troubling for a whole set of reasons. It's an unmanageable vacuum of authority, of law and order. Somehow or other, that seems also to some degree to apply to militias. I mean, militias also find it very hard to establish themselves or to project any kind of sustained influence outside whatever is their immediate home area or center of gravity. And I think this has been the case with ISIS, and I think it's been the case with Al-Qaeda as well. And so I think our figures for ISIS in Libya probably understate the problem. I suspect that there's a much higher number of people with sort of nagging sympathies for ISIS, and some unconfirmed reports that ISIS might have, might have some shell companies or fundraising capabilities that we're not clearly seeing. That would sort of make sense in a way. You would expect that in that kind of chaotic environment that there would be a fair amount of potential support for groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But I still think that really the overwhelming picture in Libya it's that security vacuum and what that means for everybody. What it means for counterterrorism, but what it also means for counter-trafficking, sort of any form of law enforcement, any form of effective international diplomatic and security engagement with Libyan authorities. So we still consider Libya to be a major worry, a major arena, but just not one in which the groups have taken particularly persuasive shape.
Wait, just a question about this. You mentioned the shell companies, and this may have been what you were referring to, but I believe it was earlier this year, was it Spain that dismantled this little financial network that was supposedly shifting money from, shell companies and Hawala network into IS Libya? Is that what you were referring to? Or are there more nodes like this out there?
I wasn't referring specifically to that, but there is some reports, again, because we only report from member states, so
right.
There's nothing in the report about this, but just things that have been said to us by non-member state interlocutors, concerns that maybe we understate the strength of the numerical strength of ISIS in Libya.
That's certainly an interesting development. I think that deserves more attention and research for sure.
Yeah,
because I think people definitely have written off IS Libya as sort of, dead and gone. But, as Bill stated with, Ansarov, like, people made the same assumption about them for 4 years between 2015 and 2019, and now they're back. So certainly, what's the potential for IS Libya to sort of be in the same stage where they're regrouping and restructuring? But a few years from now, they may be, back with a vengeance.
I totally agree with you. And I mean, we make the point in the report that the network hub that was established in Libya seems not to have thrived. And again, that goes to my point about the sort of the shape or the organization of ISIS and indeed Al-Qaeda in Libya not having emerged in the way that we feared or thought that it might. But I think the latent problem in Libya is huge.
Yeah, this, look, I always go back to, people are always very quick to declare these groups dead. I mean, not to go to Afghanistan, but I will. How many times was Al-Qaeda a D word? Dead, done, decimated, defeated, degraded. We could go on, and most written, and then we add a G word to that. President Biden said gone, and then we killed Zawahiri within a year of, you just can't write these groups off. And I always say they're, it's not that Al-Qaeda's returned or not that the Islamic State has returned. They were never gone to begin with. We may have underestimated their presence or their strength there, or in the case of Libya for both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Sure, they may not be, this is part of the ebb and flow of what we call the ebb and flow of the jihad, right? They have their ups, they have their downs, but our inability to eliminate these groups, and then you have problems with, really to me is the problem through North Africa, Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa, the weakness of the states, the inability to contain these organizations. Even if you could decimate the Islamic State in Libya, the problems with the borders, you just can't eliminate them for good. And this is a major failure, I think, in dealing with these groups holistically. We might want to try and tackle them here in Mozambique. And sure, that's working, but then we left just enough around, and then there's enough problems in surrounding countries where they could bleed back in and reestablish those networks. But I always hesitate to say they're returning as more so as regenerating. But that's, my little issue with that statement.
I think you're 100% right, Bill, and I think it leads me to a sort of a kind of an Africa, a whole of Africa comment, which is that you've got too many conflict zones in Africa of different kinds. We talked about Eastern DRC. We talked about Northern Mozambique, but Libya is a conflict zone. I mean, it is a conflict zone. It's just a particularly shapeless one. And we talked about Mali and Burkina Faso. And again, these are conflict zones. This is why the UN is moving so much of its attention to Africa right now. And I want to give a shout out to my former colleagues in UNOCT and Vladimir Voronkov, the Undersecretary General for this, because they have very definitely moved strategically towards focus on Africa. And there's a series of OCT engagements all around Africa that are going on this year and next year, recognizing this point that you're making about the fact that these problems don't go away, and these groups are there and they're latent there, even when they're not in particularly eye-catching mode. And coming back to what Caleb was saying earlier, when we were talking about the countries bordering Burkina Faso and Mali, this needs a more imaginative approach than just CT whack-a-mole. That won't do it in these places because it does nothing about the underlying conflicts. There is a need for political resolution in places like Libya. There is a need for development and social resilience being built in places like the littoral, the Gulf of Guinea littoral. And the UN is trying to do that. It's trying to marry the CT agenda with the development agenda and with the rule of law agenda. And if they can bring that off, obviously with member states being critical to this as well, and a huge amount of critical bilateral activity by member states, that's the only way that we win this, because otherwise these are just accidents waiting to happen all around the continent.
Could not agree more, Edmund. We're going to briefly jump. We mentioned the Islamic State in Yemen. That's the Al Qura office. Basically moribund. Would you agree with that, Edmund? I know you did mention you believe that some funding is flowing through there, but what's your take quickly on Yemen?
No, I think exactly what you just said. The office is largely moribund, maybe has a resilience or a relevance through its relationship across the Red Sea to Somalia. That's always been the case. There's been a connectivity between ISIS in Somalia and ISIS in the Horn of Africa and ISIS in Yemen. But in terms of ISIS's fortunes in Yemen, they've been on the decline for years now. I think they've just not managed themselves well in Yemen for a number of reasons. They got obsessed with the rivalry with Al-Qaeda. Wherever that happens, Al-Qaeda seems to win. Everywhere you look around the world, and always in these remote provinces, it tends to be Al-Qaeda that is the stronger affiliate and is able to dominate. So Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, much stronger than ISIS Yemen, and ISIS Yemen was banging its head against AQAP, and I think that weakened it. And I think also, and I speak here a little bit from my own personal affection for and experience in Yemen, the Yemenis just don't like the ISIS message. They just find ISIS ugly. It's a death cult. It doesn't in any way engage with any sort of existing social norms or tribal systems in Yemen. And I think ISIS is, it's not dead in Yemen. And we should never say that, because that's where you, as you said, you always end up by getting bitten when you say that. But ISIS has been in a period of long-term decline in Yemen.
Yeah, this is part of the inability to play well with others from the Al-Qaeda standpoint. It really hurts in tribal societies like Yemen, like Afghanistan and Pakistan and places like that. Our last topic will be the Islamic State Khorasan province and the Al-Sadiq office. We mentioned this briefly, with funds flowing from the CAR office in Somalia. This is Al-Sadiq office manages the Islamic State in Central and Southern Asia. What is the state of play for the Islamic State Khorasan province? Is it a threat to the Taliban? What's the threat to local, regional, and global security emanating from Khorasan province?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Bill. It's a complicated one. I mean, the picture in Afghanistan, as you well know, is so complicated, and it's interesting the extent to which ISIS can sort of impose this global template on a conflict that has such strong dynamics and such a strong history of its own. Really interesting to watch. My understanding of where we are at the moment is that ISIS anticipates that it will be able to survive and thrive in Afghanistan, despite the fact that it is setting itself up in opposition to the Taliban. I think they reckon that the Taliban will struggle, will not be able to concentrate force against them in the way that was possible in the past. And obviously, it was particularly true when we had the government of Afghanistan backed by its NATO partners. When ISIS suffered severe setbacks at that time in Afghanistan, one of the key factors was government of Afghanistan and NATO air power, and the fact that you could support your ground operations against ISIS Khorasan in that way. So what we're seeing now is ISIS Khorasan taking, sort of gradually sort of taking hold in some valleys, in some Salafist communities in eastern Afghanistan. It's the same broad area where they held territory before they were displaced. And at the same time, you've got this al-Sadiq office, which sits alongside ISIS Khorasan and is headed up by this guy, Sheikh Tamim al-Kurdi, also known as Abu Ahmed al-Madani, and who seems to have a perfectly functional relationship with the emir of ISIS Khorasan, who is Sana al-Ghafari. I've always been interested in whether their agendas are fully aligned, because if Ghafari wants ISIS to survive and ultimately thrive in Afghanistan, but al-Kurdi wants results quickly in Central Asia and Pakistan and India, and in that sort of wider region. How easy is it for them to sort of come together and say, okay, well, for us both to succeed, this is what needs to happen. So far, what member states tell us is that there's no evidence of friction between the two agendas. So they seem to be working okay together. And indeed, whereas early on after the Taliban takeover, there was that question mark over, well, is this a good policy of ISIS to confront the Taliban so directly when the Taliban is so big and strong? But of course, the Taliban does have so many difficulties, leadership difficulties, extreme difficulties of prioritization, tribal difficulties, and the fear of losing defectors, either foreign fighters or Afghan Talibs defecting to ISIS Khorasan. And I think that's part of what's giving ISIS the confidence to think that they can manage this. So that's where I think it stands broadly in terms of the dynamic between the two. Certainly, the Taliban are much bigger. They have the resources of a state at their disposal, but it's an impoverished state, and they've got 1 million claims on their time, and that makes it very difficult for them. And of course, because they won't honestly engage with the international community on this issue, they're not counter-terrorists, as you well know, Bill. We've had this conversation so many times before. The idea of the Taliban as a sort of counter-terrorist partner is fanciful. They just don't tell the truth about this. They were lying about the presence of al-Qaeda right up to the day that al-Zawahiri was taken out in Kabul. And then they've just been trying to come up with a new lie since then to sort of try to explain away this embarrassment that they've suffered. So, they're not going about it in a way that is rational. Their attitude to ISIS, I think, is they don't like it when ISIS are causing them direct problems. But I don't think they care when ISIS attack, Hazara Muslims. I don't think they care when ISIS attack Sufi Muslims. I don't think they care when ISIS attack in areas which are in ethnic areas that the Taliban doesn't particularly care about. So I don't think they're even fully committed to the fight against ISIS. And of course, they're not honest about the strength of ISIS. They keep saying, oh, they're not an issue, it's all under control. When we see attack after attack that make it very clear that it's not under control. So I think this is a major worry. And I think over time, it can be a threat. Well, I think it's already has the potential to threaten the neighbors. We've seen those missile attacks on Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Amateurish, not very effective, maybe didn't even hit any kind of target. But still, statement of intent, and also some cross-border activity into Pakistan. So that's already there as an issue. And the potential for ISIS-K to develop an external threat capability that could project beyond the immediate region, I think we have to take seriously.
Yeah, look, I have a lot to agree here. I think you and I may differ on the strength of the Taliban leadership and the organization, but look, that's the very little difference here in how we view this. I think the issue you discuss about the Islamic State Khorasan province attacking the Hazara and the Sufis, I think that plays into the Taliban's hands. The Taliban they're going to have to turn these communities. In some ways have to turn to the Taliban to become their protectors, because who else do they have? But it also is a weakness, right? That these attacks can occur. I think it makes them look weak internationally, but I don't think it really impacts the Taliban internally. In some ways, it strengthens them. The other issue with the Islamic State, Khorasan province, they take advantage of a Taliban Al-Qaeda's strength. This is one of those issues where a strength is also a weakness, right? Willingness to work with others and take state sponsorship makes Al-Qaeda stronger, but it's also a point of criticism, particularly the state sponsorship. The IS, Khorasan province they go out and they say this in their propaganda. Look, they're a tool of the Pakistanis, or they're seeking international recognition. I think it helps their message. So it becomes a recruiting tool for them in some ways against them with the more virulent jihadists in the region. And also, I just think that Pakistan particularly has there's a whole class of Pakistani jihadists that, groups like elements of the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for instance, that are just want to slaughter any type of minority groups that, don't adhere to their harsh version of Islam. So these groups are become a recruiting base for the Islamic State, and I think when you look at all of this put together, it's what gives them the ability to survive and regenerate their strength. But I don't think it's enough to push them over the top with the Taliban, at least not in the short to the medium term. But if the Taliban becomes more compromising on issues, I mean, I've realized we're focusing a lot on Afghanistan, but what happens in Afghanistan and also impacts what's happening in Pakistan as well as India. I'd say these are the major theaters when looking at this. And then also what happens with these groups works in groups like Tajikistan with Ansarullah, and then the Turkestan Islamic Party in China, etc. We could go on and on. Islamic movement in Uzbekistan, obviously in Uzbekistan. This is where I think the Islamic State is trying to chip away from this base of support for the Taliban Al-Qaeda alliance and use this to regenerate its strength. I think they've had, I would say, moderate success in doing that, but I'm interested in your take on that, Edmund.
I mean, I just 100% agree with you, Bill. I think everything you've just said, I think, is exactly right. I mean, I want to make the link again with Syria. Why are these groups present? They're present because they think that in the long term, the conditions will allow them to thrive. And I think Al-Qaeda sees that in Afghanistan for sure. A lot of the other groups that are broadly aligned with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban also see that. But I think ISIS see it as well. And you can make the exact same point in Syria, because there was a time when people used to say, well, why are ISIS and, Al-Nusra Front or HTS or Haras ad-Din, why are these guys in northwestern Syria where they're getting hammered, they're getting bombed from the sky, they're under sort of pressure from all directions. Is it dangerous? Yeah, sure it is. Are they losing people? Yes, sure they are. But do they think that they're going to be able to survive and possibly eventually to prevail? Yes, they do. And that's definitely true in Syria, where you have a completely intractable political situation that just gives them the confidence that they will always be able to, to find a haven in bad times and to thrive in good times for them. And I think Afghanistan's same point. The point you made about the Taliban's, is the Taliban going to create a stable, prosperous, peace-loving, diplomatic Afghanistan? It doesn't look that way to me, and I don't think it looks that way to the many, many extremist terrorist groups that are happily staying in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. And real quick on Syria, I think this is, could we just, I could only imagine what Syria would have looked like if that Al-Qaeda Islamic State rift didn't happen. And then within Al-Qaeda, basically the al-Nusra and, the split within al-Nusra, right? This is where the factionalism, that occurred in Iraq and Syria really hurt them. What would that look like today if they fought as a united front and if it wasn't again, all these problems had occurred? I mean, well, obviously, if these problems wouldn't have occurred, we wouldn't be devoting one episode to Al-Qaeda in the UN report and one episode to the Islamic State in the in your report as well. So I always find that fascinating. I wish we could build a time machine and turn back the clock and play that one out and see where it went. Would they have had more success? Would have more unified? Would they be able to stand up to the Syrian, Russian attacks and the U.S. and Iraqi offensive if they were more united, able to pool their resources instead of that factionalism that hurt these groups? Again, strengths are often weaknesses for groups like this. And I think that's sort of been a theme of this show all day. So.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, I think, that factionalism will probably continue. But, to some degree, Bill, I think we will see some of that sort of experiment that interests you. It's still to come, isn't it? The majority community in Syria does not want to be governed by Assad, does not want to be governed by Kurds, does not want to be governed by Turks. And so, eventually, what is going to become of Syria? How will that play out in terms of a long-term viable political scenario in Syria? And that's what worries me. That's why in most of these conversations we have, I come back to Syria as my biggest single worry.
Yeah, I sort of saved it for last for that reason. And I would also add this: a lot of Sunni Iraqis don't want to be governed by Iranian-supported Shia Iraqis, right? Like they perceive the militias in the Iraqi government as being Iranian-backed, and so when then you get a cross-border problem. This is how this whole problem emerged. We're looking at what we're talking about in Iraq and Syria. That also applies to Afghanistan and Pakistan to not to a degree, to a T. All these issues, they just, you can't look at these problems as a single, we just target this group in this specific country. This problem is over. There's overlying issues. You laid that out so well when talking about UN efforts in Africa. We just never, it seems that I realize this is a much bigger issue, but it seems like in the 20 years of war, the U.S. and Western coalitions, never wanted to address the war in a holistic manner. And that's why we're talking about it almost 21 years later after 9/11. Listeners, Caleb had to drop out on us. Edmund, anything else to add to the discussion?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think you just summed up the situation beautifully, Bill. And we covered it really well. It was great having Caleb bringing his expertise on Africa to bear, and just really delighted to have sort of completed the review of the report with you.
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure, and please join us again. And now that you're not with the UN, I'm interested in your take on the reports that's coming out, the things that are happening in the world. It's going to be fun to get Edmund unplugged. It already is fun, and it's these issues aren't going away. We're looking forward to having you back on. Thanks again, Edmund. Thank you, Caleb, for joining us, and thanks everyone for listening to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you could find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.